Hi all, hope we're keeping safe and well. Today we're going to start having a look at the anthology poems. We're going to start looking at each poem one by one. We're going to start with the family collection of poems, and then we're going to move on to look at the romantic ones later on. So this video is going to be about Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage. Across the video I'm going to be looking at several different sections and looking at different ways of analysing poetry, and I'm going to be using the Mitzel response style, so the idea of looking at meaning, imagery, tone, structure and language within the poem. This isn't meant to be a substitution for the notes you've got from your class teacher. This is meant to be to supplement that, to give you extra information, to give you a run through. I won't be able to talk through everything in this video, but using that strategy, the meaning, imagery, tone, structure, language, is actually a really good start, and that's what I'm going to be using to look at these videos. So I hope it's useful, and we'll see how we go with it. Okay, to start with, we need to have a copy of the poems. If you haven't got one, you can get a copy of these, the poem online, or obviously your anthology. Just to read through it to start us off, we have: Mother, any distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. You come to help me measure windows, pelmets, doors, the acres of the walls, the prairies of the floors. You at the zero end, me with the spool of tape recording lengths, reporting meters, centimetres back to base, then leaving up the stairs. The line still feeding out, unreeling years between us. Anchor, kite. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms, climb the ladder to the loft, to breaking point where something has to give. 2 floors below, your fingertips still pinch that last 1/100th of an inch. I reach towards a hatch that opens on an endless sky, to fall or fly. Okay, the first thing we want to consider when looking at a poem is the actual meaning behind the poem, what the poet is intending to do and what the poet is intending to talk about. So I'm going to start with a sort of wider outlook on the poem, about where it came from. So this comes from a collection of poems called The Book of Matches, and the idea is that these are short poems that you should be able to read in the time that it takes a match to burn down to your fingertips. Now, if we take this as a wider understanding of the poetic form, what Armitage is trying to do is trying to discuss deep and meaningful topics in quite short and interesting ways. So in the time it would take to burn a match down, he's going to discuss a really interesting and provocative topic. Likewise, the idea of it being from a book of matches is it's meant to ignite our thought process and make us think about things a little bit more. This poem itself is about the relationship between a parent and a child, and the growing movement towards independence, and the sort of fears and joys and tensions and opportunities that brings. So we have the narrator is the child, who's now an adult, and is moving into a new home, and his mother has come to help and prepare him for that move, doing lots of measuring, doing lots of preparations and helping with that move. And the poet is reflecting on their feelings at that time, whether they felt excited, whether they felt that they were growing in independence, whether they felt they would always need their parent, the mother, to help and support them. And the poem is a reflection on that. So the meaning behind the poem is this changing relationship, if you like, between a parent and a child, and the way that is expressed through this simple metaphor of moving house. The extended metaphor of moving house is moving on to a new opportunity, and a new part, a new chapter in your life. Okay, as discussed in the Poetic Terms video, one of the important ways to analyse poetry is to look at the imagery, the way that the poet creates pictures and images in our mind through their use of language, which we will focus on a little bit more later on. So some of the main images that are associated with Mother Any Distance are looking at the idea of distance, or looking at the idea of measurement. So when the poet is describing the the rooms, he describes the prairies of the floors and the acres of the walls. So this use of hyperbole, where he's describing these huge expansive spaces, a land of opportunity and openness in his new home. Likewise, probably the most famous image that we've got from this poem, or the one that most people attach themselves onto, is the end of the stanza 2, where we have anchor and kite. Now, the imagery of an anchor is something that is meant to be steady, it's meant to be sturdy, it's stable, it's reliable. And that's representing his mother and the idea of the security that she offers there. Whereas a kite is much more fragile, it's much more prone to movement, it's much more prone to being thrown around into wind and troubles and problems. So we have this idea of two images that are both linked, the anchor with a chain, the kite with a string, but they are in opposites, they are juxtaposed to each other, where we have one that is very sturdy, strong, stable, we have one which is fragile and prone to problems and issues. Likewise, we have the image where his mother is pinching the last 1/100th of an inch on the tape. Again, he's using hyperbole, the tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of the tape that's left. But the idea of pinching, this imagery of clinging on to something desperately and being reluctant to let go. We could explore the link further. We could describe this as the link, the bond between parent and child. And some people have gone even further and suggested it's a representation of things like a cord, like an umbilical cord, representing that link between parent and child. And as she holds on to one end of the tape and is reluctant to let go. The final image that we have in the poem is this, again, the juxtaposition of to fall or fly. We can imagine the poet reaching the very top of the house, opening this hatch onto the roof and seeing the endless sky opening up before him and the opportunities that offers, perhaps looking at the birds and seeing their freedom, perhaps looking at this as breaking out of this constriction that he's been faced with his parents. So there's quite a lot of lovely imagery to get from this poem. There's quite interesting things to look at. When we consider this, we have to think about what the meaning behind that is and what that's been done. But there are lots of very interesting, very concrete images that the poet is creating for us to suggest the opportunities available to him, but also his unfailing links to his mother. The tone within Mother Any Distance is quite interesting, and obviously by tone what we're meaning is the poet's feelings and the poet's attitudes. A lot of poems that we consider will have the poet feeling in a particularly strong way about one particular aspect. If you think, for example, When We Two Parted, we have the sadness of the poet, or neutral tones, we have the sadness of the poet. With Mother Any Distance, the poet is undecided, he's unsure about these opportunities, and we have that in that final line, to fall or fly. He doesn't know, he's not really sure what the best course of action would be. So tonally, there are several opportunities within the poem where the poet is showing his uncertainty. Think about anchor kite, the juxtaposition there, where we have this strong, stable, reliable aspect of the uncertainty of what we are moving on towards. So with that we have the poet's tone being registered there. We have this frustration perhaps with his parents, that he feels that he's being constrained by them, but also the fact that he requires a second pair of hands, the need for that parental support. The poet is really, really uncertain and unsure about his relationship with his parents and whether it's going to be the same after this event, after he's moved on to his new home. So tonally, the poem is really, really interesting because it does fluctuate, it does change throughout that. We do have opportunities where the poet sees himself as independent and strong and ready to move forward, opening the hatch, for example, and looking out onto that endless sky, whereas in other opportunities he sees this as intimidating and worrying, like the acres and the prairies that he describes might seem a bit intimidating or might seem a bit overwhelming for him. So we have this tone where he's considering the breaking point between himself and his parents and what that relationship is developing into and what he's going to move towards in the future. When analysing a poem, structure is one of the things that can be quite tricky to get your head around about how we go about exploring this. My suggestion would be only talk about structure if it's relevant to the question or it's relevant to what you are trying to say. There's no point saying that a poem is a 14-line sonnet that has a regular rhyme structure if you're not going to go anywhere with that. You need to be saying something that's exploring the poet's tone and the poet's attitude and the feelings, the meaning behind the poem. The first two things we've discussed here are linked to the structure and how we can infer meaning from the structure of the poem. So one of the things we could pick up from this poem is that it is a form of a 14-line sonnet. Now, traditionally, sonnets are romantic love poems. If you think about things like Shakespeare, or think about like romantic poetry, sonnets are generally romantic poems. Could this potentially infer that he has a loving relationship with his mother? And the fact that this is a sonnet in the 14 lines reflecting that love, the parental love that's there. However, the poem has an irregular rhyme structure. So could we argue that the poet is inferring that the relationship is a bit more difficult, the relationship is a bit more challenging, the relationship is a bit more complicated than we might infer from a simple love poem with this regular, clear rhyme structure? At the start of the poet makes a direct address. The very first word of the poem is mother. So we know that the structure of the poem is that this is a personal address. This is a very personal poem from the poet's point of view, and he's addressing this directly to his mother. At the end of the poem, we have an unclear future. Some poems are cyclical. They will go back to the start, they'll go back to a similar point of view or a similar perspective. This poem doesn't do that. He ends with to fall or fly, and it's an unanswered question. We do not know where the poet is going to go from here. We do not know his onward movements and what he's going to be doing next. So this structurally is very, very interesting because it doesn't give us any concrete answers. It doesn't give us any sort of this is the correct reading of this. We don't know what's going to happen next. So if you are going to talk about the structure of the poem, looking at the fact that it's an irregular sonnet structure is quite an interesting one to look at, but also looking at the address at the very start of the poem and then comparing that to the unanswered question at the very end of the poem is an interesting starting point. Okay, the final sort of aspect of poetry that we'll be looking at is zooming in on particular keywords or particular language features that have been used by the poet throughout. We've already referred to several of these when looking at the imagery created by this. So we have the use of pronouns, I find, is particularly significant within this poem. The fact that we've got you and me and the conflict between those two. This is a direct personal address to his mother, and therefore the use of the word you is significant. Look out for it and look at how they are being referred to. Across the poem, we have a semantic field of distance and measurement. So we have things like grades of distance, such as prairies, acres, but we also have things like tape, measure, distance. All this vocabulary is associated with the distance, the idea of the spaces between people, and we could infer from that we have the distances between this relationship. Have a look for all the language in there that refers to this. The poet uses lots of interesting metaphor through this. We already discussed the idea of the anchor being something that is strong, reliable. Its entire purpose in life is to hold things steady, whereas we have the metaphor for kite, where we have this free, more mobile, but more fragile opportunity there. One of the other ones we haven't quite discussed yet is the idea that he is spacewalking through the house. And if you think about this idea in a spacesuit, it seems more cumbersome, it seems more but also more free. Like if you imagine these astronauts on the moon, they're bouncing around the open wasteland that you have there. We could think of space as somewhere that's silent, somewhere that is very cold, very distant, perhaps, that we could explore there. We have uses of alliteration. So, like I said with the poetic terms video, it's no good exploring alliteration just saying that it exists. We need to think about why it's being used. If we have to fall or fly, the repetition of that F sound is juxtaposing each other. So we have the repeat of the sound is meant to reflect and show the parallels between these two opportunities that we have here. We could also consider the massive task that's been in place in this movement. So in the first stanza, we have a long list of things that need doing: windows, pelmets, doors, and the use of the asynthetic listing that we have there is giving the sense of the scale of the job, the scale of the requirements to become independent, explored by the poet there by the use of his listing. Ultimately, I think the main use of language that we have here is this extended metaphor of connection, and that idea of the unreeling years between us, the spool of tape. That's the main language device that I would be focusing on here, looking at metaphor and looking at how the poet is using this physical connection between him and his mother to represent that bond between a parent and a child. Right, for you to do with this poem, what I've done is I've come up with 2 different essay questions depending on how confident you feel with the poem and where you are in your study of the anthology poetry. The first question is just a question which could consider the poem in isolation, so just considering Mother Any Distance and considering what you know and what you identify from this. The second question is much more what you would like to get in the exam, where you are being asked to compare it to another poem of your choice. So that will consider any of the other anthology poems and think about the connection that you could make with the theme there. Same as always, if you'd like to do it as an essay plan, then that's absolutely fine. Just come up with your ideas. You would be looking ideally at about 4 paragraphs for an essay style response. And likewise, if you would like to do it as a full essay and email it to me, I'm more than happy to have a look at those and mark them. Good luck with them, and if you hang fire at the end, then we'll have today's film recommendation. Right, for my film recommendation today, I've gone for the first DVD I ever bought, which is a good bit of trivia for you. Okay, this is an amazing story that reinvigorated what they call the swords and sandal genre, and that's Gladiator. It has one of the best opening sequences I think I've ever seen, where it's the battle with the Goths in the barbarian Goths rather than people who like goth music. In the woods, and the use of the flaming arrows and things is absolutely fantastic. It's a great story. The sequences in the Colosseum are absolutely incredible. It's got a fantastic score as well, amazing music, so check it out. It's really, really good. Okay, until next time, I hope you stay safe, and then next time we're going to have a look at Walking Away.